All right, welcome back to City of Seattle Budget School 101. My name is Omari Salisbury, joined by Kevin Schofield of SCC Insight. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Hey, I thought I was out of going to class, but you got me back in class here. The main point of our budget school is, again, it's a big budget. The last episode we learned is $6.6 million in the City of Seattle budget. And a lot of big numbers get thrown around all the time. And we wanted to put something together here in bite-sized pieces so people can learn more about the budget process. And, in doing so, you can hold your elected officials accountable and give your input on budgets and some of everything else. And so on that note, we'll dive right into episode 2. Last episode, we talked about what is the budget. We found out, like I said, there's some big money in that budget, $6.6 billion. But it's not just like my budget is just my budget. But when it comes to the City of Seattle, the budget is also the law, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the city budget has the force of law. So the only money that can be spent by the city is money that is approved in the city budget to be spent. We'll get into some interesting issues because that doesn't necessarily mean that all of it is going to get spent. But if a city official tries to spend money that isn't authorized in the budget, that's a violation of the law. They can personally get in trouble, and they could even potentially be held responsible to pay it back out of their own bank account. So this is something that happened earlier this year with Councilmember Sawant, where she was found to have violated a campaign law because she spent some of the money that was in her city council office budget to support the Tax Amazon ballot initiative campaign, right, which is illegal under campaign finance law. And she was actually required to pay that money back herself because she had illegally spent city funds, right? So there's real consequences to city officials for doing this sort of thing. But there's a whole big body of law, in fact, several of them, that apply to what has to go in the budget, what can't go in the budget, with the process for creating it, and all the restrictions and authorizations that are in it. And so, let's spend some time and kind of walk through those different parts of it. The budget is governed by the Washington State Constitution, by Washington State law passed by the state legislature, by the Seattle City Charter, and by ordinances that are passed by the city council and mayor. So, and they all have different roles that they play in figuring out kind of how this budget thing has to happen in here. So let's start with Washington State law. Washington State law says that the city must pass a budget every year. They have to do it every fall before the new fiscal year, before actually the new calendar year starts. And that budget, the state law says it has to be proposed by the mayor. She or he has to gather information for all the different city departments and the revenue estimates and pull it all together, propose it to the city council. City council can then take that, change it however it wants, and then pass it. And then the mayor has to either sign it or veto it and send it back for potentially a veto override or for changes, right? The state law also says that the city must have a balanced budget, that annual expenditures can't exceed the money that the city has available. Now, mostly that's revenues, that's taxes and other fees and revenues that come in. But, if they have some money left over from the previous year, they can carry that over and spend that in the next year. And that's kind of important because sometimes, like a project is running late, like a road project or something like that, and they don't finish it up in the calendar year, and they want to be able to carry that money over and spend it in the next year. So they have some flexibility to do that with leftover dollars. And it also doesn't mean that the city can't borrow money, right? It can. It does that through a process called bonds. We talked about that a little bit in our first segment here. Bond proceeds, what the money they bring in when they sell a bond, is revenues that they can build into the budget as revenues. But then the debt service that they have to pay on those bonds becomes expenses that they have to build into the expense side of the budget. Now, one of the things that's really important when we think about the budget here is that there's a really, really important difference between the Washington state government and the Seattle city government. Washington state is what's called a sovereign entity, right? And while Washington state and the state government can't violate the US Constitution, can't violate federal law, beyond that, it can pretty much do whatever it wants. It can pass whatever regulations it wants. It can pass whatever taxes it wants. It can structure itself however it wants to do that, right? So it's really sovereign and has a lot of power to kind of set its own rules. Again, with the exception that it can't violate federal constitutional law. But the city of Seattle is not sovereign, right? It doesn't have any of those kind of inherent powers. The only powers and authorities that the city has are the ones that are granted to it explicitly by the state of Washington as a sovereign. So the city of Seattle has no inherent authority to tax us. It can only tax us in ways that the state of Washington allows it to do that, right? So Seattle is what's called a municipal corporation under state law, and it's also what's called a first-class charter city under state law. And so those laws that the state passed basically give a whole bunch of rights and responsibilities and authorizations as one big package to the city. And that's where it gets most of its power to tax us, but it also gets requirements like, well, okay, you can tax and spend money in these ways, but you also have to have a budget in order to guide the way that you do that. And as a first-class charter city, it has pretty broad authority for the kinds of taxes it can actually do but although state law often will cap those, or sometimes the state constitution will cap those. So property taxes, for example, there's a really hard cap in the Washington State Constitution on property taxes about how much it can be. The state can do its part, the city can do its part, but anything beyond that has to be approved by voters. And that's why we get property tax levies on a regular basis, is because the city government, the city council and mayor basically maxed out the amount they can do themselves. And if they want any more property tax beyond that, they have to put it to us to vote on that, right? So that's one kind of example of that. The city can also impose what are called excise taxes, which are taxes that they put on some kind of transaction, like a sales tax on buying something, right? Or businesses get lots of excise taxes on different actions that they do, like hiring an employee or paying an employee, right? And excise taxes are taxes on the privilege of being allowed to do something, like run a business. And where this gets goofy with the laws a little bit is because city governments that want to pass some excise taxes can declare anything they want to be a tax.
But in Seattle, they usually do.
And in Seattle, they usually do. But at the end of the day, the court gets to say whether those things are really taxes or whether they're inherent rights, because they can't do an excise tax on a right that you or I have. They can only do it on a privilege that the government allows us to have.
So can you give some examples of this?
Yeah, so a while back, the city of Bellingham tried to impose an excise tax on employees for essentially the right of holding a job and getting a paycheck. And the courts in Washington State threw that out, saying, no, working for a living is a right, right? It's something that's essential, right? If you want to live your life, you have to be able to bring in money, right? So working for a living is not something that you can put an excise tax on. But Seattle's new payroll tax that they just recently passed is an excise tax on companies for the privilege of being able to run a business in Seattle and hire employees and pay those employees. Now, it was challenged in court, and the lawyers who challenged it said, no, this is really the city of Bellingham all over again. You're really, a payroll tax is a tax on employees. The only difference is being paid by an employer instead of employees. And so far, the courts have said, no, that doesn't fly. That's really a different thing. But you can see that's kind of the tension that goes back and forth on what's a right and what's a privilege, right? So you may recall a few years back, the city passed a progressive income tax on all of us, which that was also challenged in court. And the case was super complex. There were 3 or 4 different laws and parts of the state constitution that they argued that it violated. And we could do a whole separate 15-20-minute segment just on that income tax ordinance and case. But in the end, the courts ruled that Seattle does actually have the authority to pass an income tax because under state law, it's a kind of property tax. But because of the restrictions in the state constitution on property taxes, it would have to be a flat tax. They couldn't actually do a progressive tax where people who make more income are taxed more on it than people who make less income.
It's a lot about taxes,
A
man.
well, that's a big part. That's a
That's
huge
where
part
the
of the
money
revenues
comes
for the
from.
city. Yeah.
That's where all the money is coming from. And I think a lot of times too, people who don't pay any tax or a minimal tax don't. There's a disconnect between people who are taxed a lot for whatever different reasons, by the way. Even like you can be poor and pay a lot of, you're paying a business tax, you're paying a registration fee, and
Sales
this and that,
tax.
sales
tax
taxes.
is a really big aggressive tax that hits poor people hard.
Yeah. So what else does the state of Washington have to say or govern over the city?
Yeah, the state passes all sorts of restrictions on how different kinds of taxes and fees can be used. So city can impose an excise tax on, for example, real estate transactions, right? That's called REACH, real estate excise tax, up to a certain amount, but it can only be used for certain purposes. State law says it can be used for transportation, infrastructure, and as of a recent change, affordable housing. But they can't just like use it to hire more people on any old, in any old department, right? And when the city imposes a fee, like a street parking fee, right? The money that they raise from that has to be spent on something that relates to what the fee is being charged for, right? So for street parking, the money they raise from that has to be plowed back into transportation. So they could use it to improve, the parking meters, the whole parking meter system, something they did recently, or, improve parking, make more parking available, and general street improvements. But they can't use it for like the fire department or the police or something like that. So whenever, Parks Department, same thing. When Parks charges fees for using a field or some kind of facility, there are lots of sports teams and things that pay fees to use those things. The money they raise from those fees has to be put back into the Parks Department, has to be put back into those fields and those facilities, right? So that's a limit on how fees, can be raised and can be used. State also caps things like car tax, right? As we know, because we went through a whole Tim Eyman thing recently about that. Another really significant limitation, the state constitution prohibits gifts of public funds, right? And this is something that's been really a bit controversial from time to time. With the exception, you can see in the wording here on this, there's an exception in the state constitution to support the poor or infirm. So poor people or sick people, the city government and state government can give money to people to help them with those. But it can't just give money to any old organization or to you or me because somebody in the government likes us, right? And so if, for example, the city wants to create a new kind of grant program to help BIPOC communities in the city, right? Then they have to do that in a way where they're not just giving money out. They do these through RFPs where they sign contracts with these organizations and they get something back in return from those organizations for the money that they're giving them, right? So that's why we see these RFPs, and that's why we see so many city departments push so hard on signing contracts. This is because they can't just give out money.
That's why they use the word BIPOC too.
Yeah,
as opposed to a specific race.
Well, and then we're going to get to that part because that's a whole separate problem, right? You may remember Tim Eyman's Initiative 200 from a couple years back, which prevents racial preferences in government programs, right? So the city can't create a program specifically for Asian people or for Black people or for white people, right? They can create a program to help underserved communities, to help things. And if they put in an RFP and a Black-led organization submits a proposal for a program that they want to run, they can potentially fund that. But the program as a whole can't have racial preferences. But it's really there still isn't a lot of court cases that determine kind of where the boundaries are. So the city government really treads very lightly in going around and making sure they're not doing something that violates Initiative 200 in this. So you can see writing a budget is not simple for the city, right? They have all these state laws and state constitutional limitations that they have to follow in what money they can raise and how they can spend that money.
Right. So what is the city law? I mean, you talked a lot about the state.
That's
and
a
clearly
state,
the state brings the hammer and kind of sets the infrastructure. But what does the city law say?
So the city law is much more around process. It says how the budget has to be put together, what the mayor's role is, what the city council's role is, what the timing is for all of that. So it says that the mayor has to deliver a proposed budget by a date close to the end of September. This year it's going to be September 27th. And then the city council has a couple of months to work on that and change it however they want. And then by a date in early December, the city council has to officially pass a budget for the mayor to approve or veto. It also says that the mayor can veto the budget, just as he or she can veto any other bill that the city council passes. And then if it's vetoed, it goes back to the council potentially to override it. But that's a place, just a little side story here, that's a little weird, right? And it's a case where sometimes you find, in state and city laws, not to mention federal laws, somebody made a mistake, and that mistake ends up being codified in law, and it's just a weird thing. So normally when the city council passes a bill, just ordinary bill, like a new regulation or something like that, it takes 5 members it takes a majority, 5 of the 9 city council members to pass it, right? And then if the mayor vetoes it, it goes back to the city council and it requires a 2/3 majority, or 6 out of the 9, to override that veto. So the bar for overriding a veto is higher than it is for just passing the bill in the first place, right? And that sort of makes sense, right? If the mayor's a check and balance on the city council, then there ought to be a higher bar on that. But a budget bill is different. A budget bill requires a 3/4 majority, or 7 out of 9 city council members, to pass it in the first place. But what the city law doesn't say, and what the city charter doesn't say, is how many votes it takes to override a veto of a budget bill. So if you read what it says about overrides, veto overrides, you can read it and squint it and go, that kind of looks like it says 6 out of 9 votes, or 2/3. But that would be weird, because then it would take less votes to override a veto than it did to pass a budget bill in the first place. So this actually came up last summer when the city council, redid the budget because of the COVID kind of hit to the revenues, and the mayor actually vetoed it. Mayor doesn't veto a budget bill very often because a lot of work goes and a lot of compromise goes into it. But she vetoed it and sent it back. And then the city council and its lawyers had to go, wait a minute, do we need 6 votes or 7 votes to override it? And at the end, they made sure they had 7 votes. Nobody could ever come back to them and say, no, that wasn't a legal override of that. We don't have a legal budget here. So they made sure they hit the highest bar they could possibly be asked to hit to get that put through.
Yeah, those guys.
Those guys, yeah. So city and state laws set up this kind of check and balance, or if you want, maybe a tug of war between the mayor and the city council over the budget, right? So the mayor can't spend a single cent that the city council hasn't appropriated in that budget. But at the same time, the city council can't force the mayor to spend that money. Right?
So they can't force the mayor to, the mayor can't spend any money that they don't approve,
right?
But the mayor doesn't have to spend the money that they approve.
That's right. Mayor doesn't have to spend the money, right? So
I'm sure that causes a lot of tension.
And we've seen that play out last year, and this year has been a major source of tension. We've seen things like frustration by the city council, where they've appropriated a bunch of money for tiny home villages to build out more of them. But tiny home villages, it turns out that finding a site where you can actually place one, and then getting everything, not only the facilities to build out the homes and get them placed there, and the power and the water and everything else you need to do that, but then all the wraparound services you need. Are there enough staff? There are labor shortages in a number of those different community-based organizations right now. So getting all the things in place to actually set up a tiny home village and build it out is really hard. So it's taken a lot longer than city council wanted to build these out. And they've gotten pretty frustrated. And sometimes they say, yeah, okay, this is hard and logistically difficult. And sometimes they just complain that they think the mayor is dragging her feet on this, right? So there are all these tensions in this. So the mayor, has her side, the city council have their side, but the council, even though they can't force a mayor to spend the money, they still have a bunch of tools that they use to try to bend the mayor to their will, right? And so let's talk about some of those. One of those is something we talked about last time, provisos, right? Where the city council can attach a restriction or a rule or sometimes a freeze on some set of money and say, okay, mayor, I know you want to spend this money, but you can't spend it until you do this thing. Maybe come back to us with a specific spending plan for how you're going to spend it. or do this other thing. So they get kind of like, well, you can't spend this money and do this thing you want to do until you do this other thing that we want you to do first, right? So they use provisos to, kind of do a little bit of that. They, because the city council officially writes the budget, they get to control line items, and every line item has a rule associated with it of how the money can be spent. So the city council can have a big bucket of money that has more general rules, in which case the mayor has some flexibility about how to spend it within it, or it can have a whole bunch of small buckets of money that all have separate rules. So for example, SPD's budget for patrol officers for a very long time, for many, many years, was one big bucket of money across all the different precincts, all 5 precincts in the city. But the city council last year said, yeah, we don't like some of the decisions you're making about spending more in this precinct and less in this precinct. So we're going to break up that patrol budget into a separate line item for every precinct, and we're going to put a separate set of money into each of them. So you have a set of money you can spend on the South Precinct, one on the East Precinct, one on the North Precinct, and you can't move money between those without coming back to us and getting us to approve that, right? So that's another tool that they use. They also create things like they call funds, right? In which case it's something used where all the revenues that come in from a particular source, like a tax, like the payroll tax or the food and beverage tax, go into a fund, and that fund also has rules about what it can be spent on. So they've set these up in the last couple of years for the new payroll tax and for the sweet and beverage tax because they didn't like the way the mayor was trying to spend some of it in ways that beyond what they originally intended. And then the last thing they can do, and we talked about this a little bit last time too, is the budget isn't one and done. They can go back and change it anytime they want. And they've been doing that a lot this year with SPD's budget, where we just went through a thing where SPD has about $15 million of salary savings because they're understaffed this year. And rather than give SPD the flexibility about how to spend it, they've gone back and changed the budget to take a bunch of that money back, give it to some of it to community-based organizations. But even the money they kept in SPD's budget, they put in specific line items to basically tell SPD how to spend that money.
The budget is guided by a lot of different laws.
Yep.
This is what I'm getting out of this budget school episode 2 here. It's a lot of different laws that are tied in here. And now I guess I have a better understanding why somebody's always like, oh, the city's getting sued over this tax. Yeah. And the city's getting sued over this or over that because there's so many laws around it.
And why the city council has their own staff that deal with budget, why there are all these lawyers that pay attention to every time they want to pass a new tax or revenue, all these lawyers attend because they got to figure out, is this legal? Can we really do this? And can we spend the money that we want to spend it?
They must got some good lawyers because there's a lot of tax in Seattle.
There's a lot of tax in Seattle. No, that's definitely true.
All right. So tell us what's coming up in the next episode.
Yeah. So from here, we get to talk about budget process. We can kind of walk through, what are the different steps that we go through with the budget? What does the mayor do and deliver on September 27th? What are the different steps that the city council lays out for itself to walk through the different, and make the changes that it wants in the budget? And then what happens at the end once the city council is done? From there, we're going to do a deep dive kind of on the revenue side, and then one on the expenses side, and we're going to finish up this part of budget school by talking about how you can get involved and give your input to our elected officials.
All right, good stuff.
All right.
I mean, I'm here for it. Clearly,
you're not going anywhere, man.
No, I can't wait till they get into the weeds, though.
There's so many weeds.
That's where like you said, the play-by-play.
Oh yeah,
I'd rather play-by-play on the budget than play-by-play on the protest, man. You know what I'm saying? It's like this is my speed. Kevin Schofield, thank you. City of Seattle Budget School, episode 2 is in the books.
Thank you, sir.
All right.